All right, folks, so we're moving on to what is ISIS. I turned off the webcam in the interest of uploading time. So we've moved over to what is ISIS. So we just finished up with Al-Qaeda, right? And ISIS kind of took over for Al-Qaeda. As Al-Qaeda died down, a lot of its members jumped over to this organization and kind of formed this new organization. It's known as ISIS. So a group of Muslim fundamentalists that formed in Syria during the civil war that's currently going on in that country formed this organization known as ISIS. Many of them are former Al-Qaeda members. Some of them have left Al-Qaeda cells and they've gone into Syria in order to take advantage of the civil war there to try to cause as much terror attacks as possible. And what they've done is they've seized control over a large amount of territory in Syria and Iraq. And they've declared that area a new sovereign country that they believe to exist. The name of that country is the Islamic State of Syria. That's where we get ISIS. It's a derivation of that name. And in those areas of Syria and Iraq that they claim for themselves as sovereign, they've established a very strict version of Sharia law. They've tried to ethnically cleanse non-Muslims from the area so that there's only Muslims remaining. So Christians and other groups have been wiped out. They have tried to destroy, for instance, Christian artifacts that are located in that area. Again, they're using Sharia law. So, for instance, a ban on a lot of Western traditions. You're not allowed. You must grow beards, for instance. You're not allowed to listen to Western music or television. You're supposed to maintain a very strict, devout version of Islam according to the teachings of the Quran. ISIS has had so much success that they've now spread not only into Syria, but into neighboring Iraq and other areas like Libya and sub-Saharan Africa. The U.S. just left Iraq last year, or a few years ago, but we're still trying to support the Iraqi government against these serious threats. ISIS has really achieved a lot of its growth because of their skilled use of the media. They use technology like social media, the internet, and sites like Twitter to recruit new members, to highlight successes that they've had. For instance, a lot of the times the bombings and other attacks they've done are recorded and then posted online, and to try to attract supporters and just media attention and publicity as well. So part of the reason for their enormous growth was their use of technology. They have a large number of radical Westerners that have joined their ranks. So they've been able to recruit a lot of folks from Europe and the United States who have actually left their home countries, gone to Syria and Iraq, and have joined forces with this terror network to fight alongside them. So here we see members of ISIS in the picture up here in the top right. We see more members of ISIS, and they generally wear black, and they use a black flag with Arabic lettering on it to symbolize their area. That is the leader of ISIS, or at least formerly. We believe he is now killed. The red area on this map indicates the areas that were under ISIS control up until a couple of years back. Now, recently, the U.S. government, in combination with other groups, has been able to take most of this territory back from ISIS. So Iraq has control over most of this red area again. Most of the area in Syria has been reclaimed by the Syrian government. So again, ISIS is on the run today, just as Al-Qaeda was a few years back. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens down the road if members of ISIS join a new network or if we're able to eliminate them entirely. Again, Al-Qaeda and then later ISIS have declared what's called a fatwa. Remember, that's a religious call to all Muslims to wage a holy war against their enemies. And in this instance, they believe their enemies to be the United States, Israel, and any allies that fight alongside the United States and Israel. Basically, anti-United States terrorists are generally one of two groups. They're either Islamic fundamentalists, and those could either be foreign residents who have gotten into the United States, or they could actually be U.S. residents or citizens who become radicalized after they're already inside the United States, thanks to social media or other methods. The other category of terrorists that generally attacks the U.S., if it's not an Islamic fundamentalist, then usually it's a domestic terrorist. And these are usually white males. They're usually opposed to government intrusion. They believe that our constitutional rights are being violated and that they must take arms in order to protect their fellow Americans' rights under the Constitution from abuse or threats by the U.S. government. So you have two wildly different groups of terrorists that commit most attacks in this country, either religiously radicalized on one side or politically radicalized American citizens on the other. Now, besides all that, remember, terrorist is not done by an official country most of the time. It's usually done by a group located within a country. Most of the time, these terror groups are not connected to the government of that country, although sometimes they might be. And so, how do countries or states provide support for terrorism? Well, the answer to that is in one of three primary ways. First off, they can provide sanctuary for terrorists who are maybe wanted in another country. So, for instance, in Afghanistan, a group known as the Taliban gave sanctuary, which was safety, to Al-Qaeda, and allowed Al-Qaeda to set up their bases in Afghanistan and to plan and launch attacks against the United States and Israel. That's an example of how a government, in this case the Taliban in Afghanistan, gave sanctuary or safety to terrorists that were wanted by the United States and other countries. Another way that a state could provide support for terrorism is to supply terrorists with the weapons that they need, or the money that they need, or intelligence, for instance, spy information they might need in order to complete their attacks. So, hey, here the government isn't directly taking part in the attack, but it's providing the weapons or the finances or the information necessary for the terrorists to do their job. Finally, in some instances, countries may actually actively plan attacks that are then conducted by terrorists. This means that the government of that country plans the attack out, but they don't want to get caught, I guess you could say, by the rest of the world for actually doing the attack. So what they then do is they either train or hire terrorists to conduct the attack on their behalf. Again, three different ways that states can, in theory, support terrorism in different ways. So let's take a look at some examples here in these final two slides. First off, I give you a laundry list of countries. Libya, for instance. How did they support terror? Well, they actually planned attacks that used terrorists. For instance, in the 1980s, the Libyan government organized a bombing of a German nightclub. And they planted bombs. Well, they built bombs that terrorists then used on various airplanes to take them down. In both instances, we believe the Libyan government, under their dictator at the time, Muammar Gaddafi, were responsible for planning and supplying these attacks. And ultimately, they found terrorists that were willing to do the jobs for them. Afghanistan as well. As I just mentioned, the Taliban provide sanctuary to other terrorist groups that were located there. Now, the Taliban are no longer in charge in Afghanistan, but when they were a very strict conservative group of Islamic fundamentalists, and they helped hide and protect al-Qaeda leaders like Osama bin Laden. That became the headquarters for all of the terrorism that was going on around the world at that time. However, in 2002, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan after the 9/11 attacks in order to remove the Taliban and to capture or destroy al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Other examples of how states can support terror. The United States believes that Iraq has supported terror in the past by supplying weapons to terrorist groups. In fact, the U.S. government invaded Iraq in 2000, believing that Iraq was supplying weapons of mass destruction to terrorist organizations. A lot of people disagreed with the U.S. government, and in fact, there was never any direct evidence to show that that was true. But needless to say, that was one of the reasons, that was one of the countries, Iraq, that the U.S. believed was supplying weapons to terrorists. Iran is a country that provides sanctuary to terrorists and other groups. Again, Iran is a religious Islamic government. They are a theocracy, a religious government, and they run their government based on Sharia law. In Iran, I should say, the United States accused Iran of providing sanctuary to some al-Qaeda members when the U.S. was actively searching for them in Iraq or in Afghanistan. Other countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, and Yemen have terrorist organizations that are actively working at this time to overthrow the actual government of those countries. So in each of those countries, we have a radical group, a rebel group that is Islamic fundamentalist that is currently working to overthrow the government and create a fundamentalist Islamic government in those particular countries. All right. So anyways, the United States is in blue here. Green countries are ones that we've identified as supporting terror. Those include Iran, Iraq, right, Syria. Those include Sudan. Those include Libya. Those include North Korea. They include Yemen down here as well. All right. Oh, and we threw in Cuba, even though I'm not quite sure how much terrorism they're doing these days. Final slide here. Current states that have active terror networks in them. Well, Iraq, Syria, and Libya all have the remnants of Al-Qaeda and ISIS that are located there, along with other terrorist groups not connected to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And they control a lot of territory in these countries, although much less than they used to. Some of these groups have actually been able to get some of their terrorists into Europe, taking advantage of those open borders, and they've been able to attack places in France and Denmark by either citizens of those countries who have been radicalized or by individuals who have been able to get into Europe and conduct attacks once they were inside. Why are they operating in those areas? Well, remember, terror groups have challenged government control in all of those countries after the Libyan, Syrian civil wars spread over into more places. Violence spilled over into Iraq. The United States and other countries are currently fighting an air war in support of the Iraqi government against Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and some of these other groups. Speaking of these groups, ISIS likes to use a lot of suicide bombers, and they love to use social media to spread their messages and attract supporters. And one of the other things they've done is capture Americans or other Westerners, hold them for ransom, and if the ransom isn't paid, occasionally they have executed some of these hostages, oftentimes by beheading them. Afghanistan, we still have some remnants of Al-Qaeda that are located there as well. They continue to operate in Afghanistan against an American-supported government. They fight wars and they commit suicide attacks to try to undermine the government of Afghanistan. In Somalia and Ethiopia, there's a group known as Al-Shabaab. They are an Islamic group, and again, fundamentalists. They've used suicide bombs, explosives. They even attacked a shopping mall that Westerners like to shop at in some of those countries, in an effort to try to slow down the spread of Western beliefs and to undermine confidence in the government of those countries. And finally, in Nigeria, there's another Islamic group known as Boko Haram. They are a fundamentalist Islamic group that's attempting to overthrow the secular government of Nigeria. They would like it to become more Muslim-friendly, and they have attacked and massacred many villages. They've kidnapped hundreds of girls, held them for ransom. They've used suicide bombers. Again, all of these are really designed to convince the people in these countries to lose faith in their own government and to maybe allow some of these fundamentalists to take over the government and create a government that's going to bring control and security to that place. So that's terrorism in a nutshell and why it's such a tricky political thing to have to deal with. Hopefully this helps you as you are planning for your big test.